I'd like to start actually by talking a little bit from my own personal experience as a human rights activist. Last autumn, I was lucky enough to be at the Capitol when Aung San Suu Kyi came to receive the Congressional Gold Medal. I've been an activist on Burma for 20 years, and I had a moment where I got to shake her hand, and of course, the thing I did straight away was take a photo and upload it to Instagram. And it set me thinking about the nature of media and media generation around human rights. Because I thought back to 1988 and 1990 when I first got involved, and there was so little imagery from Burma. There was one clip that year after year people would reach out to me and say, "Do you have that footage? How do I get hold of that clip?" And then I thought about 2007, when the monks went on the street in the Saffron Revolution, these tremendous images, and there were a few courageous people in Burma who documented then with handheld cameras, but mobile phones cost $1,000 to get a SIM card, so very few people had them. And then about 4 months ago, I guess, I was in Burma. Amazingly, I was in the country where for 20 years I'd been campaigning from outside, and I was standing outside Aung San Suu Kyi's house when President Obama came to visit. Tremendous crowd, amazing energy, and everyone had a mobile phone, and they were filming this same moment. And then I thought about what was going on in the north of the country, and I knew there were places where there was ethnic cleansing going on, there were violent attacks going on ethnic minorities, and there were very few images. And this really kind of captured for me this tension that is at the heart of Witness's work, which goes back right to when we were started at the Rodney King incident, when it was this idea of how do you think about the potential of the citizen witness? The person like George Holliday, who filmed the original Rodney King incident and then turned that into a news sensation. This was the beating of an African-American man in Los Angeles, and a court case. And Witness came out of that moment thinking, what if instead of the accidental witness, it was the purposeful witness who was documenting these things? So let's fast forward 20 years, and we are in what we often think of as this cameras everywhere moment. And I want to be careful about that word. Let's be clear. Probably most people in this room have a camera. There are many places where there aren't. But the movement is tremendous. And it's a movement that is about cameras, but it's linked to mobile devices, and it's linked to the internet. And the media that people are creating is huge. The volume is incredible. This was an interesting statistic from last year that I pick up on a lot, because when we think about human rights video, we often think about Coney. But the vast majority of that citizen witnessing is coming out of those 72 hours. It's the person in Syria, in East Timor, in Central African Republic, and there are huge amounts of it. There were 350,000 hours of video uploaded from Syria last year. Just think about that. Video that shows a lot of the atrocities that are going on there. And this is uploaded by a huge diversity of people. This clip kind of captures some of the people who I see in that universe. It's everyone from the people who are in Tahrir Square or in the Occupy movement. It's citizen activists working in places like Mexico and Kenya. It is the people who curate that video. And I often think of curators as a really key part of this, and they're, in some senses, the crowdsourcers, the people who look at the volume of video and make sense of it. And it's also the people who you don't expect. So a lot of the video that I encounter as a human rights activist is, in fact, perpetrator-shot video. It's the video, in this example, of the policeman in Egypt who was beating someone and filmed it for his own entertainment. So I want to focus on one aspect of this vast diversity of people. I want to think about how we harness the witnessing capacity of the crowd. So I'm not going to talk in this talk about some other ways we could think about crowdsourcing. I'm not going to talk about how we harness the potential of the crowd to solve the problem, or to craft the solutions or identify the solutions. I'm going to say, how do we tap into this vast volume of people who are ready to be the first-person witness? The first-person witness to the atrocity in the street in Syria, or the act of police brutality in New York. And there are three questions that we really grapple with in human rights work about how do we do this. And this really relates back to what Jennifer was talking about as well. How do we enable people to do this impactfully, safely, and ethically? How do we do that in a way when it's not just about the places where there can be lots of witnesses, but also the places where there aren't many, and where there's not something that's so easily documentable? So beating someone in the street is documentable. A hurricane is documentable. A lack of access to education is not like that. It's a far more difficult topic to grapple with. And then a third question, which comes up in my world, and it's about images, but it applies to any form of information. And I think it's particularly dangerous in the case of images. How do we turn this volume of images into something that provides motivation to action, rather than this decontextualized kind of sense of compassion fatigue? And I bet any of you who've watched a video from Syria probably felt afterwards, what on earth do I do now? Now imagine if you're trying to watch 200,000 of those, or sift through 200,000 of those. And this Auden quote often really brings it back for me. The issue that most of the time, people don't want to pay attention to this. They don't want to react to it. They want to be able to turn away. Every act of human rights violation occurs against the backdrop of the rest of us getting on with our lives. So I want to talk about 5 challenges and opportunities that I think we need to address in order to support citizen witnesses and make them part of this tremendous pool of capacity in a meaningful way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do, but also about what other people are doing. So the first area is the issue of trust and authentication. There is so much of this volume of video, but people look at the material from Syria and say, how do I know that is true? How do I know that wasn't falsified? How do I know that's true evidence that could be used in a court, used in news, or be used to warn the next community along that they are at risk? So if you look at this image, do we know this is a phosphorus bomb in Syria? Should this be war crimes evidence? Or was this all photoshopped together? Or was this an execution in Sri Lanka? Was this an extrajudicial execution where the military took 6 unarmed civilians or prisoners of war and executed them? Or has it been staged? Can we use this as a way to prove a crime or to generate international attention? This is an issue that many people are grappling with. I was recently at the International Criminal Court, and they're looking at the case of Libya from last year. And most of the evidence they'll have to deal with there is material that was uploaded by those citizen witnesses to places like YouTube and Facebook. So they're grappling with this in court settings. And what this means is often they're trying to go through 4 key elements that are critical to understanding whether something is valid. These are very simple, and actually they're pretty common to the news journalism world as well, which is, who shot it? Where did they shoot it? Who else can tell us whether this is true? And what's been the chain of custody in legal terms? But we might also just put that very simply, who's tampered with it? Who might have got hold of it? And there are a number of ways people are grappling with this, and we've already touched on in Jennifer's presentation, the range from the human to algorithmic. I actually think some of them are very basic. We spend a lot of our time training people to think about how they validate in the frame. So if you're a citizen witness, this is a tremendously courageous man called Ahmed Biassi in Syria, who in a video held up his identity card and said, I can prove that I was the man who was abused in this square. Now that puts him at tremendous risk. There are other solutions in the world I operate in that are about the intersection of that bravery of an individual and the power of looking, for example, at the Google Maps that show whether a particular location looks like that at that time of year, listening to the accents. I've put up the example here of a group called Storiful we collaborate with, who do that. So they take a piece of citizen evidence, they look at it, they say, are there the signs of authentication in the frame? Can we look at a Google map and see if it looks like that? And can we also look at the social media ecosystem around it that tells us whether other people tweeted that, whether the person who shared it first is reliable? Have they shared many reliable pieces of information over time? And we've also been thinking about how you think about this technologically. One of the projects we work on at Witness is a tool called InformaCam, which is a way of when you take an image or a video of embedding all the types of data that are gathered on a mobile device, the GPS, the latitude, the direction you're moving in, and securely encrypting them into the file in a way that can show this is what that image looked like at that moment, and this is all the data that can help you address those who, what, when, where, why questions. And to do that, of course, you have to think about safety. So when you share a file like this, you have to think about who you share it to and who can decrypt it. An element of that as well that we're working on, and I've put a mock-up here, this is not a camera that exists, is thinking how do you make this mainstream? Because most people don't download apps before they go into a human rights violation. They witness it, or they're using their devices. We've been thinking a lot about how spaces like YouTube or phones build in what might be considered an eyewitness mode into the way they function, because then it's accessible to the 800 million people who use YouTube or Facebook, not just the people who've downloaded an app. Related to this, and as I say, you've also got to think about privacy, safety, and consent. So this is an image from Iran after the Green Revolution, when the Iranian government crowdsourced the identification of protesters who had taken part in the Green Revolution in 2009. This is sinister, and it's sinister because they put it publicly, but of course governments look through and sort through data, looking for people who speak out. So we think a lot about that flip side of what it means to become part of this citizen witnessing ecology. It means putting yourself at risk, often without knowing what tools are available to protect you. Now, we work in video, so a lot of our focus is around how you think about tools that anonymize people in images. And that's both the people in the protest, but it's also the lone woman in a country like Zimbabwe who speaks out about sexual violence during the elections. And in fact, she's far more vulnerable than the people in a protest, because she's the one person who stood up and said, I want to make sure this becomes a data point, becomes the way in which you secure justice here. One way we've been addressing that is thinking about how you develop tools like ObscuraCam. This is exactly the opposite of the InformaCam tool. It strips out most of the data in an image and blurs out faces. And as I said, I think it's important we think about where these become mainstream. So we were part of an effort to advocate to YouTube to build in a tool like that into their platform. Because ObscuraCam is being used by 100,000 people, this tool on YouTube can be used by 1 billion people. So that when you pick up your tool and you're in this crisis setting and you're thinking, how do I become a citizen witness, you have the tools available to you to address the core problem sets that you may be grappling with. And as I say, the importance of engaging with the tech companies here when you're thinking in the kind of citizen witness mode is key. These are some of the slides actually from the Arab Spring where people put up these sometimes slightly ironic references to, thank you Twitter and thank you Facebook. But at the same time, these are so critical. If you want to crowdsource, if you want to surface these first-hand witness accounts, you have to be there. I'm actually going to move to an end on an issue that we're still grappling with, and it's the same question of how we translate that information into action. And I will not mince my words around this. There is a question of whether we have a supply side that doesn't meet the demand side, if we're to be brutally honest in the kind of economics of this. We're trying something out here. We have a project with YouTube on the Human Rights Channel where we validate and verify human rights footage and we contextualize it as human rights. So instead of it just being another man beaten in the street somewhere, this is evidence of a war crime. So how do you translate this? How do you surface the material that is in a space like YouTube, which is in some sense a giant pool of potential citizen witnesses? This is a playlist from Syria. And the final opportunity, and I think this goes to how we think about education and training, is how do you get the skills to people, how do you get them to people more rapidly and to a broader range of people to be citizen witnesses? And I often think here in terms of a basic witnessing literacy. I actually think we should be teaching a witnessing literacy that is part of being a citizen. And what I mean by that is just as in the same way that you learn about your ABCs, I want to think about what is the Dr. Seuss ABC of witnessing something. That might be witnessing a human rights violation, it might be witnessing a news event, it might be witnessing a fender bender. How do we enable people now that we have this capacity to be part of that ecosystem of media to do that well? So let me end on that point. I think these are the spaces we need to address and look forward to talking more. Thank you.
Yeah. Is there a question from the panel?
I have one for you. Well, as you know, GPS was originally military technology that was then demilitarized and arguably changed the nature of all of our work, basically, both disaster relief and in humanitarian support and so on. At the same time, we're seeing things happening in imaging capture space. So, for example, the recent revelation that there is drones that you can fly 3 miles up with 1.2 gigapixels that allow you to identify people on the ground. And so the technology for having continuous city or continuous country, very high-res imagery 24/7 is possible. How do you, in your work, think about capabilities like that coming online?
Yeah, I think there's this kind of dynamic between what you might think of as eyes in the sky and eyes on the ground. I think there is a powerful balance between them, which is about what works for different things. So actually I think eyes on the ground work about personal testimony, sharing experience in a way that kind of sort of look from above doesn't. So that's like an affect approach. I also think it's probably worth recognizing at the moment the imbalance of power is biased towards the state in terms of using those high, using aerial surveillance, using satellites. And so we focus very much on how do you think about the sort of the tool in the pocket and the accessibility, and in some sense the volume of ways in which individual citizens can do it versus the sort of the totalizing look from the top. But I think the two can match together, and I think there have been some interesting projects to try and start doing that.
And I think one of the interesting things is that as we project the future forward, that asymmetry grows less and less, right? I mean, there's a very active do-it-yourself drone movement right now.
Sure.
And there are, I don't know how many drones there are flying around right now that are owned by citizens for exactly that purpose.
Yeah, the Drones for Human Rights movement is, emerging.
Good.
Is there a question from the floor while Craig comes up?
And we'll take it. Here we go.
Come on,
You get extra credit for asking a question. Here you go.
There are some very bad historical precedences about citizen witnessing. I'm thinking in terms of Russia in the 50s, Stasi, religious police in various countries. How do you think about that?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question. I think one of I'd end up at where I ended at the last point there, which is how do we think about witnessing literacies that are positive, that are about the power of surveillance directed towards perpetrators and towards the government or the state, so potential repressors. I think it's a key part of it. I'm not going to jump to the conclusion that citizen witnessing leads to that direction. I think it's very much about how we educate people and think how they can learn and approach it.
People aren't like that.
I would disagree, actually. I think that most of the people who are witnessing in the context of Syria are doing it because they see injustice. The vast majority of the people who I work with around the world are thinking in those terms. Do I think there is a possibility, particularly if the citizen witnessing is controlled by the state? So if the state mandates something, I think there's a very different structure. If there's coercion by the state to be involved in a process of witnessing towards others, absolutely. That's not the power of people. That's the power of the state coercing individuals to be part of the state apparatus. So I think I would distinguish between being co-opted into a state apparatus and the power of individuals to hold the state and others accountable.